The cargo ship called the Lullaby drifted into Halo Station like a tired old dog limping home, and the man behind the controls looked about as worn out as the ship itself. Sergeant Ethan Calloway, retired, had not been a sergeant in 6 years, but the name stuck to him the way scars stuck to skin, and he had plenty of both. He rubbed the back of his neck, where a plasma burn had left the flesh shiny and tight, and he guided the ship into docking clamp 7 with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. Halo Station was not a place anyone came to on purpose. It sat on the edge of Concord space like a forgotten tooth in the back of a mouth, and it smelled about the same. The corridors were narrow and greasy. The lights flickered in a rhythm that suggested the power grid was held together by hope and electrical tape. Refugees from 6 different species crowded the walkways, and none of them looked happy to be there. Ethan was there for fuel cells and protein packs, nothing more. He had a delivery to make 3 systems over, and he wanted to be gone before the station's docking fees ate into his already thin profit margin. He pulled his jacket tighter, stepped off his ship, and walked into the lower market. He found the fuel cells easy enough. The protein packs took longer, because the vendor tried to sell him expired stock, and Ethan had not survived 5 military campaigns by being stupid. He checked every date, paid in standard credits, and loaded the crates onto his cargo dolly. It was on the way back that he heard the sound. It came from a side alley between 2 massive waste compactors, a narrow gap filled with broken containers and leaking pipes. The sound was small and wet and wrong, and Ethan knew it immediately, because he had heard it on battlefields across the galaxy. It was the sound of a child trying not to cry. He stopped. He looked down the alley. His hand went to the light on his wrist, and he clicked it on. 2 small shapes huddled against the far wall, pressed together like they were trying to disappear into the metal. Behind them, slumped against a pipe, was a dead man, some species Ethan did not recognize, with a smuggler's belt and a face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The wall behind the body was blackened and warped, as if something impossibly hot had hit it. But Ethan barely looked at the dead man. His eyes were on the children. They were Dracari dragonkin. He could tell by the small ridged scales on their arms, and the faint nubs of horns pressing through their hair. They were young, maybe the equivalent of 6 or 7 human years, and they were in terrible shape. Their scales were a flat, lifeless gray, which even Ethan knew was wrong, because healthy dragonkin had scales that caught light like gemstones. These scales looked like ash. Their clothes were torn. Their ribs showed through their skin. The bigger one pushed the smaller one behind her, and bared her teeth at Ethan. It would have been threatening if she was not shaking so badly. Ethan set down the cargo dolly. He lowered himself to one knee, slowly, the way he used to approach wounded soldiers who were too frightened to accept help. He held up both hands, palms open. "Hey there," he said quietly. "I am not going to hurt you." The bigger girl hissed at him. The smaller one had not made a sound at all. She stared at him with enormous eyes that looked like they had seen far too much for someone her size. Ethan did not move. He just stayed on one knee with his hands up, and he waited. He was very good at waiting. It took 11 minutes. The bigger girl's hissing faded to a low growl, then to silence, then to the shaky breathing of a child who had run out of energy to be afraid. Her legs buckled, and she sat down hard, still holding the smaller one behind her. Ethan reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out a protein bar. He peeled the wrapper and set it on the ground between them, then pulled his hand back. The bigger girl stared at it. She looked at Ethan. She looked at the bar. Again at Ethan. Then she snatched it, broke it in half, and gave the bigger piece to the smaller girl before eating her own half in 2 desperate bites. Something cracked inside Ethan's chest, a feeling he had spent 6 years trying to bury under freight contracts and engine maintenance. It was the feeling he got when he saw someone who needed help and knew that no one else was coming. He called station security. They came 40 minutes later, which told him everything he needed to know about how much they cared. Two bored officers looked at the dead smuggler, looked at the children, and shrugged. One of them told Ethan that unclaimed dragonkin would be processed and sent to a labor settlement on Grekov 4. A mining colony where life expectancy was not a number anyone talked about. Ethan felt the old fire light up behind his ribs. That had once made him carry a wounded soldier 9 kilometers through enemy territory because the evacuation shuttle was not coming. "I will take them," he said. The officers stared at him. A human fostering dragonkin was practically unheard of. Dragons were proud, ancient, powerful, and they did not mix with lesser species, even their own outcasts. "Your funeral," one officer said, and handed him a datapad with emergency foster forms. Ethan filled them out on the spot. Getting the girls onto the lullaby took patience. The bigger one could walk but would not let go of the smaller one's hand. Ethan carried the smaller one when her legs gave out, and she weighed almost nothing, which made him angry in a quiet and dangerous way. He cleared out a cargo bay and worked through the night. He bolted sleeping cots to the floor, hung thermal blankets, wired a heating unit to keep the room warm because he knew dragonkin needed heat, and set up a small table with 2 chairs. He fed them soup because their stomachs would not handle solid food yet. He treated their cuts and scraps with his old field medical kit. The bigger girl watched everything he did with fierce, suspicious eyes. The smaller one fell asleep in her cot within minutes, and Ethan noticed that she had not spoken a single word. He sat in the doorway of their room and kept watch because that was what you did. Over the next 2 days he learned fragments. The bigger girl began to understand his words, even if she struggled to speak standard. He started calling her Kira because she kept making a sound like that when she pointed at herself. The smaller one still did not talk, so he called her Sail, after a quiet river on his home planet, because she had the same calm, deep stillness. On the 3rd day, as Ethan powered up the lullaby and plotted a course away from Hilo Station, Kira climbed into the co-pilot seat that was far too big for her and looked out at the stars. "Men," she said in broken standard, and Ethan looked at her. "Bad men took us from Mother." Ethan nodded gently. "We will figure it out," he said. "You are safe now." He assumed her mother was a common dragon worker, maybe a laborer on some forgotten colony. He would put out inquiries and try to reunite them. It was the right thing to do. He had no way of knowing that their mother was the most powerful being in the known galaxy, a creature who could crack planets, and who had not slept in months because her children were missing. He had no way of knowing that at that very moment, across 1,000 light-years of cold space, Queen Veilithra the Cataclysm felt a tiny pulse in the psionic web, like a heartbeat she had thought was gone forever. Her golden eyes opened in the dark of her throne. Her fleets began to move, and Ethan Calloway, retired sergeant and freight hauler, buckled his seatbelt and asked Kira if she wanted to learn how to read the star maps. 3 months changed everything and nothing at the same time. The lullaby still creaked through the frontier star lanes, carrying whatever freight paid enough to keep the fuel tanks full. Ethan still woke at the same hour every morning and drank the same bitter coffee from the same dented mug. But now there were 2 small pairs of boots by the airlock door, and crayon drawings taped to the cockpit walls, and the sound of arguing, in a mix of broken standard and Drakari, coming from the cargo bay that had become a bedroom. Ethan had learned a lot about raising dragon children in 3 months, mostly through failure. He learned that Kira could eat 4 times her body weight and still ask for more. He learned that dragonkin stomachs could not process dairy, a lesson that cost him 2 days of cleaning and a ventilation filter he would never get the smell out of. He learned that Sail needed a heat lamp to sleep, or she would crawl into the engine room and curl up against the reactor casing, which merely stopped his heart the first time he found her there. He learned that Kira was brave and loud, and burned with a fury that seemed too large for her small body. She growled at strangers. She put herself between Sail and anything unfamiliar. She once tried to bite a docking inspector who reached for Ethan's papers too quickly. He learned that Sail was quiet and deep, and saw things other people missed. She drew constantly, filling every scrap of paper and then moving to the walls themselves. Her pictures were strange and beautiful, full of dark shapes and golden light and stars that seemed to move if you looked at them long enough. He learned that both of them had nightmares. The nightmares were bad. Kira would wake up snarling and thrashing, her small claws leaving marks in the metal cot frame. Sail would wake up silent, with tears running down her face, and those were somehow worse. Ethan handled them the way he handled everything, with patience and presence. He would sit on the edge of their cots and talk in a low, steady voice about nothing important until their breathing slowed. He would tell them about the river on his home planet, about the smell of rain on warm ground, about the dog he had as a boy who was afraid of thunder. He did not know much about Drakari lullabies, so he sang human ones, badly. His voice was rough and out of tune, but the girls did not seem to mind. Sail would close her eyes and lean into his side, and Kira would pretend she was too tough to need comfort, while slowly moving closer until her head rested against his arm. Small things became routines, and routines became rituals, and rituals became the architecture of a family that none of them had planned for. Breakfast was eggs, because eggs were cheap, and the girls loved them, even though Kira set the pan on fire at least once a week. Lessons were in the afternoon, using free education programs from the Concord database, and Ethan would sit with them and help Kira sound out standard words, while Sail quietly worked 3 levels ahead of where she was supposed to be. Evenings were for stories, and Ethan read to them from an old datapad loaded with human children's tales that he had downloaded at a station library. The girls were fascinated by human stories. Kira loved the ones about warriors and heroes. Sail loved the ones about clever animals who outsmarted bigger creatures. Both of them were confused by the concept of snow. But strange things were happening, things Ethan noticed but could not explain. Kira was strong, far too strong. One morning she bumped into a steel bulkhead panel while chasing Sail through the corridor, and left a dent the size of a dinner plate in solid ship-grade metal. She looked at it with wide eyes, and then at Ethan, and he could see the fear in her face. He just shrugged and said they would patch it later, and the fear melted away. Sail hummed in her sleep, a low vibrating sound. That made Ethan's teeth ache. The first time it happened, every instrument on the ship went haywire for 6 minutes. Screens flickered, navigation went offline, and the artificial gravity hiccuped hard enough to send Ethan's coffee mug floating across the cockpit. He ran diagnostics for 2 days and found nothing wrong with the ship. Their scales were changing. The dull gray was shedding away in patches, revealing new growth underneath that was dark and rich and strange, almost black, but not quite, with a shimmer that caught light in ways that made the scales look like they contained tiny fires. Ethan assumed it was a sign of better nutrition and health. He was proud of that, proud that his care was showing in their very skin. He did not know that those colors had not been seen in the Drakari species for a generation. That void black scales, laced with gold fire, were the unmistakable mark of the royal bloodline, or that every Drakari in the galaxy would have recognized them on sight. He just thought his kids were growing up healthy. The trouble came at Redfall Depot, a refueling station that sat at the crossroads of 3 shipping lanes. Ethan was offloading a cargo of industrial parts when 4 figures approached his ship. 3 were Calvari, a reptilian species known for piracy, and 1 was human, which made it worse because humans who ran with pirate crews tended to be the most desperate and dangerous kind. They wanted the ship. They did not care about the cargo. They wanted the lullaby itself, because even an old freighter was worth good money stripped for parts. Ethan told them to leave. They did not. He saw one of them glance toward the viewport where Kira's face was pressed against the glass, watching, and something cold and absolute settled into Ethan's chest. He had sworn off violence. He had put away his armor and his weapons, and told himself that part of his life was over. But the part of him that was a soldier had never really left. It was just sleeping. He walked to his quarters. He opened the locker he never opened. He put on his old combat armor piece by piece, the ceramic plates scarred and faded, but still solid. He picked up his sidearm and checked the charge. He walked back out. The fight lasted 4 minutes. Ethan used the narrow corridor of the docking tunnel as a choke point, the same way he had held a hospital bunker on Varanus 3, with nothing but a medical team and a broken rifle. The pirates had numbers, but he had training, and he had something they did not, something that made his hands steady and his aim true. He had something behind him worth protecting. A plasma bolt grazed his shoulder and burned through the muscle. He barely felt it. He put 2 pirates down with stun rounds, drove the third back with suppressive fire, and the fourth, the human one, looked into Ethan's eyes and saw something there that made him turn and run. Ethan sealed the airlock. He treated his own, wound with one hand while calling the girls on the intercom to tell them everything was fine. But Kira had seen. She had watched through a crack in the door as this soft, gentle man, who read bedtime stories and burned breakfast, had stood bleeding in a corridor and refused to fall. Not for money, not for pride, but for her and her sister. No Drakari commoner would have done that for someone else's children. The strong protected themselves. That was the Drakari way. But Ethan's way was different. Ethan's way was to stand in fire for people he loved, simply because he loved them. She did not have the words for what she felt. She just crawled into his lap that evening, careful of his bandaged shoulder, and stayed there until she fell asleep. A week later, Sael brought Ethan her drawings. She had never shown them up close before. He sat on the floor with her, and looked through them one by one, until he reached the image she kept drawing over and over. A massive dark shape, 6 wings, spread across a field of stars, crowned with horns that looked like they were made of black lightning. The creature was enormous and terrible and beautiful, and Sael had drawn it with more detail and care than anything else. Ethan pointed at it. "What is that, sweetheart?" Sael touched the drawing gently and said one word in Drakari, a word Ethan did not understand. Mathara. He smiled and told her it was a beautiful drawing and that she was very talented. He did not know the word meant mother. And he did not know that far away, in the cold between stars, ships with scales of iron and hearts of nuclear fire were hunting for the 2 small girls who sat on his floor and colored with broken crayons, and that the net was closing tighter every single day. The corvette appeared out of nowhere, dropping from hyperspace so close to the lullaby that the proximity alarm screamed, and Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. It was a Concord naval vessel, sleek and gray, and armed with enough firepower to turn his old freighter into scrap metal in about 2 seconds. The name on the hull read CNS Blackthorn, and the voice on the communication channel was calm and professional and left absolutely no room for argument. Freighter Lullaby, this is Commander Ayla Shin of Concord Naval Intelligence. You will cut your engines and prepare for boarding. Non-compliance will be met with force. Ethan looked at the corvette through his viewport. He looked at Kira, who was sitting in the co-pilot seat with her knees pulled up to her chest. He looked at Sael, who was drawing on the floor behind them. "Girls," he said quietly, "go to your room and stay there until I come get you." Kira opened her mouth to argue. "Now, Kira." Something in his voice made her obey without another word. She took Sael's hand, and they disappeared down the corridor. Ethan cut the engines and opened the airlock. Commander Ayla Shin was not what he expected. She was small for a naval officer, sharp-featured and dark-eyed, with the kind of face that processed information the way a computer processed data, fast and without sentiment. She came aboard with 4 armed Marines and a scanning technician carrying equipment. Ethan did not recognize. "Sergeant Calloway," she said, and it was not a question. She already knew who he was. "Retired," he said. "We have been tracking anomalous psionic energy signatures in this sector for 7 weeks. The source has been traced to your vessel." She looked around the cockpit at the crayon drawings taped to every surface, at the small boots by the door, at the half-eaten plate of food on the console. "I was expecting a weapons smuggler." Disappoint. Shin was not amused. She gestured to the scanning technician, who began sweeping the ship. The Marines spread out, and Ethan followed them with the careful attention of a man who did not like armed strangers near his children. The technician found the source in under 3 minutes. He walked to the door of the cargo bay bedroom, and his scanner went wild, the readings spiking so high that the device made a sound Ethan had never heard from any piece of technology. A high, thin whine, like it was afraid. Shin looked at the readings. Her face did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a tiny crack in the professional mask. "Open the door," she said. Ethan did not move. "Those are my kids in there." "Sergeant Calloway, open the door. Tell your Marines to lower their weapons first." Shin studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded at the Marines, and they lowered their rifles. Ethan opened the door, teeth bared, claws out, every scale on her small body raised in threat. Sale sat behind her on the cot, clutching a drawing to her chest. Behind them, the thermal blankets and children's books, and the stupid little nightlight shaped like a star that Ethan had bought at a station market 3 systems back. Shin stared at the girls. She stared at their scales, the new ones coming in dark and shot through with veins of molten gold. She pulled up a classified file on her datapad and held it next to them, comparing. She zoomed in on the scale patterns, the horn ridges, the shape of their eyes. The color drained from her face. "Everyone out," she said to her team. "Now, out of the room." The Marines looked confused but obeyed. Shin closed the door and turned to Ethan, and the look on her face made his stomach drop, because it was the look of someone who had just realized they were standing next to a bomb. "Do you know what you have?" she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "I have 2 little girls who need lunch in about an hour. Sergeant, their psionic output is registering at royal class magnitude. Those scale patterns are void black with gold threading. That combination has not existed in the Drakari species since the last Queen's bloodline, which is the current Queen's bloodline." She paused, and Ethan could see her struggling to say the next words. "These children are the missing heirs of Queen Vaelithra." The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend metal. "Their mother," Shin continued, "is the supreme monarch of the Drakari Dominion. She is the most powerful psionic entity in the known galaxy. She can crack a warship's hull with her mind. She has been searching for these children for nearly a year, and she has made it very clear that she will burn entire star systems to find them." Ethan processed this the way he processed incoming fire, quickly and without panic. He looked through the small window in the past. Door. At Kira and Sael. Kira was trying to look fierce. Sael was drawing. "Are they in danger?" he said. Shin blinked. "Did you hear what I heard you. Are they in danger? Right now, today, are they in danger?" Shin's expression shifted, something like respect flickering across it, before she controlled it. "Yes, Lord Zarvek, the Queen's cousin staged a coup attempt, and had the children smuggled away to be killed. He failed to secure the throne, but he controls significant military forces. If he finds the girls before their mother does, he will kill them to eliminate rival claims to power. He has hunters called the Ashfangs sweeping the frontier." Ethan was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he asked for star charts, showing the Ashfang's known search patterns, the location of Zarvek's forces, and the trajectory of the Queen's fleet. Shin gave them to him, because by that point she understood that this man was not going to hand the children over. Protect them himself. I need to tell them, Ethan said, more to himself than to Shin. He went into the room and sat on the floor between the two cots, the way he always did when something important needed saying. Kira watched him with eyes that were turning more golden by the week. Sail put down her crayon. I found out something about where you come from, he said carefully. Your mother is not a common dragon. She is the Drakari Queen. Kira's face went through several expressions very fast. Fear, confusion, something that might have been recognition, and then a look that was pure desperate hope, followed immediately by pure desperate terror. You send us back, she said, and it was not a question. It was the sound of a child who had learned that good things always ended. Ethan got down on both knees so he was at her eye level. He took her hands, small and clawed and trembling, in his rough calloused ones. You are not princesses to me, he said. You are my kids, and I do not abandon my kids. Not now, not ever. Do you understand me? Kira's golden eyes filled with tears she would never admit to. Sail moved from her cot and pressed against Ethan's side. She looked up at him and spoke her first full sentence in Standard, clear and certain, and carrying a weight that made the air hum with psionic resonance. You are our fire, Ethan. He did not know that in Drakari culture, calling someone your fire was the deepest declaration of family, stronger than blood, stronger than oaths, stronger than any bond their ancient species recognize. He just knew that it made his throat tight and his eyes sting. Shin watched from the doorway and said nothing for a long time. Later, aboard her corvette, she contacted her commanding admiral and requested authorization to provide escort protection for a civilian vessel. The admiral asked why the Concord Navy should risk a diplomatic incident with the Drakari over one human, 2 orphans. Shin was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that would later be quoted in history texts, though she did not know it at the time. Because if we do not protect a man who chose to be a father when no one else would, then what exactly are we defending? The admiral authorized a small escort. 3 days later, every telepathic species in the galaxy heard the same thing, at the same moment. A psionic broadcast so powerful it rattled windows on planets thousands of light years from its source. A voice ancient and vast and burning with a fury that made stars feel small. Return what is mine, or I will unmake your worlds. On the lullaby, the bulkheads vibrated, the lights flickered. The ship groaned like a living thing in pain. Kira grabbed Ethan's hand. Her claws dug into his skin. He squeezed back. It is going to be okay, he said, and he meant it, even though the most powerful creature in the galaxy was coming. Though warships were hunting them. Even though he was one man in a battered freighter, with nothing but a medical kit and a sidearm, and a stubbornness that bordered on insanity. He meant it, because that was what fathers did. They promised it would be okay, and then they made it true. The trap closed around them in a dead-end system with no name. Just a catalog number and a dying red star that painted everything the color of old blood. Ethan had been running for 9 days straight, jumping from system to system along routes so obscure they did not appear on standard navigation charts. Shin's 2 escort corvettes flanked the lullaby like guard dogs, their sensors sweeping constantly for the hunters they all knew were coming. Kira had stopped sleeping. She sat in the cockpit and stared at the stars with her golden eyes wide and her small body rigid with a tension no child should carry. Sail had gone quiet again, not the peaceful quiet of a calm child, but the deep silence of an animal that sensed a predator. Ethan felt it too. He could not explain how, but something in the back of his skull hummed with a low dread that was not entirely his own. Shin told him later that the girls had begun to unconsciously extend their psionic field around him. Into their awareness, the way dragonkin bonded with family. It meant they could feel his emotions, and he could feel echoes of theirs. He felt their fear, and it made him angry in the cold, clean way that had kept him alive through 5 campaigns. The Ashfangs came out of the dark like wolves. There were 6 of them, HFY war vessels built for speed and violence, their hulls covered in scales of living metal that shifted and rippled as they moved. They did not announce themselves. They did not demand surrender. They simply opened fire. Shin's corvettes responded instantly, peeling away from the lullaby to engage. The space between the ships became a storm of plasma bolts and kinetic rounds, and the bright hot lines of directed energy weapons cutting through the void. The corvettes fought well, human crews working with a desperate precision that held the line far longer than anyone would have expected. But the Ashfangs were HFY warships crewed by HFY warriors, and the gap in raw power was enormous. One corvette lost its shields in the first 2 minutes. The second took a direct hit to its engine block and began venting atmosphere. Ethan watched his escorts die and felt the old familiar helplessness of a medic watching people bleed out beyond his reach. But he did not freeze. He never froze. He grabbed the intercom. "Kira, Sail, get to the safe room now. Lock the door, and do not open it for anyone who is not me." Kira's voice came back small and fierce. "I can fight. You are 8 years old. Get in the room. Now." He heard them running. He heard the heavy door seal. He turned back to the viewport and saw what he had been dreading. A boarding craft, barbed and black, punching through the lullaby's hull like a fist through paper. The ship screamed as metal tore. The lights went red. Emergency alarms filled every corridor with noise. Ethan went to his locker. He put on his armor for the second time in 3 months. He checked his sidearm, his combat knife, the 3 stun grenades he kept for emergencies. Then he walked toward the sound of his ship being torn apart. The Ashfang lieutenant came through the breach first. He was enormous even in his humanoid form, 8 feet tall, with scales like black iron and eyes that burned with actual fire. He wore armor that seemed grown rather than built, fused to his body like a second skin. In one hand he carried a plasma lance that hummed with enough energy to cut through a tank. Behind him came 4 more warriors, each one a killing machine bred and trained for exactly this kind of work. The lieutenant looked at Ethan and dismissed him in the same glance, the way a wolf might look at a rabbit. "The children," the lieutenant said in standard that was thick with contempt. "Where are the children, human?" Ethan stood in the corridor between the boarding party and the sealed door 30 meters behind him. Narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people side by side. The ceiling was low. The footing was uneven where hull plates had buckled from the breach. It was a terrible place for a large HFY warrior to fight. It was an excellent place for a human combat medic who had spent his career in tight spaces, keeping people alive under fire. "You are not getting past me," Ethan said. The lieutenant laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the genuine amusement of a being who could not believe what he was hearing. Then Ethan hit the emergency vent on the corridor section behind the Ashfangs. The blast of decompression sucked 2 of the warriors back through the breach and into space before they could react. The lieutenant braced himself, and the remaining 2 grabbed the walls, but the sudden loss of atmosphere and pressure staggered them for 3 precious seconds. Ethan used those seconds. He fired his sidearm at the corridor junction box above the lieutenant's head, and the ceiling exploded in a shower of electrical discharge that turned the metal floor into a crackling death trap. The 2 lesser warriors went down twitching. The lieutenant came through it, because of course he did. His armor absorbed the worst of it, and he charged down the corridor with the plasma lance raised and murder in his burning eyes. Ethan met him with a stun grenade to the face. The flash and sonic blast would have killed a human at that range. It barely slowed the lieutenant down, But it bought Ethan 2 more seconds, and 2 seconds was enough to duck under the plasma lance and jam his combat knife into the gap between the lieutenant's chest plate and shoulder guard. Drakari blood was hot, literally hot, and it burned Ethan's hand as it poured over the blade. The lieutenant roared and backhanded Ethan across the corridor. Ethan hit the wall hard enough to crack the armor on his back. He tasted blood. He felt ribs break. At least 2, maybe 3. His vision went white, and then red, and then gray at the edges. The lieutenant pulled the knife from his shoulder and tossed it aside. He walked toward Ethan without hurry. "Brave for a human," he said. "Stupid, but brave. Give me the children, and I will make your death quick." Ethan pulled himself up the wall. His legs were shaking. His left arm was not working right. Something was wrong inside his chest, something that gurgled when he breathed. But he got to his feet, and he stood in that corridor, and he looked the lieutenant in the eye. "No," he said. The lieutenant raised his lance, and then the sealed door behind Ethan opened. The psionic shockwave hit like a physical wall, a blast of raw psychic force so powerful that the metal walls buckled outward, and the lieutenant staggered back 5 steps as if struck by a battering ram. Kira stood in the doorway, and she was different. Her scales had completed their transformation, void black and alive, with threads of gold fire that pulsed like veins carrying liquid starlight. Her eyes blazed solid gold, no pupil, no white, just molten light. 2 heart fires burned in her chest, visible through her skin like twin suns trapped inside a small body. She was still a child. She was also something ancient and terrible, waking up for the first time. Sail stood beside her, equally transformed, but where Kira burned, Sail shimmered. A barrier of pure psionic energy surrounded the lullaby, visible through the hull breaches as a dome of pale gold light that sealed the atmosphere in and held the remaining Ashfang ships at bay with a force that made their weapons look like toys. The lieutenant stared at them, and for the first time in his life, he felt fear, not because of what they were, but because of what he saw in their eyes. They were not looking at him. They were looking at Ethan. Kira screamed, not in words, but in pure psionic fury, and the lieutenant's armor cracked from throat to waist. He flew backward down the corridor and through the breach and into the cold vacuum, where Sail's barrier caught him and held him like an insect in amber. Then the girls ran to Ethan. He had collapsed against the wall, breathing in short, wet gasps, his broken ribs grinding, blood soaking through his armor. They knelt beside him, one on each side, and they placed their small hands on his chest. Warmth flooded through him, deep and golden and alive. The pain faded. The ribs knit. The bleeding stopped. The gray edges of his vision cleared, and he could breathe again. They had power enough to crack warships, and the first thing they did with it was heal their father. "I told you to stay in the room," Ethan whispered. Kira gave him a look that was pure stubborn fury through her tears. "You are stupid," she said. "You are so stupid, and we love you." The sky outside broke open. A ship dropped out of hyperspace that was less a ship and more a living mountain of black iron and ancient fire. The Obsidian Throne, 5 kilometers of Drakari warcraft that breathed and pulsed with the heartbeat of its queen. The Ashfang vessels tried to flee and were swatted from existence like sparks. Then the hull of the lullaby peeled apart, not violently, but with a terrible, careful precision, like a hand opening a delicate box. Light poured in, hot and golden and overwhelming, and in the center of that light was a shape so vast and so magnificent that Ethan's human mind struggled to hold it. A dragon in true form, 6 wings spanning a kilometer, scales of absolute black drinking in starlight, crowned with horns that crackled with energy that smelled like the birth of stars. Queen Veilithra the Cataclysm looked down into the broken body of a human freighter, and found her daughters. They were standing over a wounded man with their wings spread to shield him, their faces turned upward in defiance. Kira spoke to her mother in Drakari, and her voice did not shake. "He is our fire. If you take us from him, you are no different from Jarvek." The Dragon Queen, who had ended civilizations, who had burned fleets and shattered worlds, and ruled an empire for longer than humanity had possessed language, went very still. She looked at Ethan Calloway, this small, broken, impossible man, who had fought a Drakari warrior with a knife and 3 stun grenades and the sheer irrational refusal to let anything hurt his children. He looked back at her. The inside of the obsidian throne smelled like hot metal and something older. Something that reminded Ethan of standing too close to a lightning strike. The corridors were enormous, built for beings that could shift between humanoid and true dragon form at will, and Ethan felt like a mouse walking through a cathedral. 2 Drakari guards, the size of small buildings, escorted him. He was unarmed, still wearing his cracked and blood-stained armor, walking with a limp. He was too stubborn to show. The girl's healing had saved his life, but the exhaustion ran deeper than bone. They had taken Kira and Sail to a separate chamber, and that fact burned in Ethan's chest hotter than any wound. When they had tried to separate the girls from him, Kira had nearly brought down a section of bulkhead with a psionic blast before Ethan talked her down. He told her it would be okay. He promised he would come back. He did not know if that promise was his to keep. That was not a throne room in any traditional sense. It was open to space, the far walls simply absent, replaced by a shimmering energy field that held in atmosphere while revealing the vast black ocean of stars beyond. In the center of the room stood a figure in humanoid form, tall and impossibly elegant, with scales of absolute black, and eyes like 2 golden suns burning in a face that held the kind of beauty that made you forget to breathe and remember to be afraid. Queen Veilithra the Cataclysm looked at Ethan the way a storm looks at a candle. "Sit," she said. There was 1 chair. It was human-sized, which meant she had ordered it placed there for him. That small detail told Ethan more about this conversation than anything else could. He sat. "You took my children," Veilithra said. "I found 2 starving girls in a garbage alley, and I fed them. You kept them. You did not seek Drakari authorities. You did not contact the Dominion. I thought their mother was a laborer. I planned to search for her." Veilithra moved closer, and Ethan could feel the psionic pressure rolling off her, like heat from a furnace. It pressed against his mind, not attacking, but testing, feeling for cracks and weaknesses and lies. "Why?" she said, and the word carried a weight that suggested she had been asking it of the universe for a very long time. "You are human. You are fragile. You gain nothing from this. Why did you take my children in?" Ethan looked at this ancient and terrible queen, and he answered the only way he knew how, with the truth, plain and undecorated. "They were cold and hungry and alone. That is all I needed to know." Veilithra studied him in silence for a long time. The psionic pressure increased, and Ethan realized she was reading him, not his thoughts exactly, but his memories, his emotions, the shape of who he was. He should have been afraid. He was too tired to be afraid, and too honest to have anything to hide. She saw everything. She saw him kneeling in that alley with his hands up, waiting 11 minutes for a terrified child to stop being scared of him. She saw him working through the night to build a bedroom out of a cargo bay. She saw the burnt eggs and the bedtime stories and the off-key singing. She saw him bandaging Kira's scraped knee while she insisted she was fine. She saw him carrying Sail to bed when she fell asleep on the cockpit floor with a crayon still in her hand. She saw him standing in a burning corridor with broken ribs and a knife, refusing to move. She saw a man with no power, no leverage, no advantage, pouring everything he had into 2 children who were not his own, for no reason except that they needed someone, and he was there. Veilithra turned away from him and faced the stars. "My people are the strongest in this galaxy," she said, and her voice had changed, the command replaced by something raw and heavy. "For 10,000 years, we pride ourselves on power, on dominance, on the ability to crush anything that threatens us." She paused. "And when my daughters were taken from me, when they were cast into the darkest corner of the frontier to die, not one Drakari found them. Not one of my kind, with all our power and all our ancient wisdom, thought to look in a garbage alley on a station that no one cared about." She turned back to Ethan. "A human found them, a human with a broken ship and a medical kit. A species my people consider barely more than clever animals." Ethan said nothing, because he could see what this was costing her. "You did what my entire empire could not," Veilithra said. "You did it without scales or fire or psionic force. You did it with soup and blankets and patience. And my daughters love you in a way that they have never loved me, because you earned it simply by being there." "They love you too," Ethan said quietly. "Sail drew you every single day, a great dark shape with 6 wings. She never stopped drawing you, not once from the first day I had her." Veilithra went very still, and Ethan saw something he would never speak of to anyone, not as long as he lived. He saw the most powerful being in the known galaxy close her golden eyes and press her hand against her chest, as if something inside it had broken open after being sealed shut for a very long time. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but thinner than before, like a blade that had been sharpened until it could cut the hand that held it. "Lord Zarvek will be dealt with. His forces are already surrounded. His allies are abandoning him. This will be finished within the week." Ethan nodded. "The question that remains is, what to do with you?" "I am not leaving them. I could destroy you where you sit. I know. You are not afraid. I am terrified. But I am not leaving them." Long time, and something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement of one stubborn force meeting another. "No," she said, "I do not believe you would." What happened next would be studied by diplomats and historians for centuries. Queen Veilithra issued a decree that had no precedent in 10,000 years of Drakari history. She named Ethan Calloway Calvari, Keeper of the Flame, a title that made him recognized family to the royal bloodline. He was the first non-Drakari to ever hold it. And when the announcement reached the Drakari homeworld, the silence that followed was louder than any roar. The children would be raised jointly. Kira and Sail would spend time on the Drakari homeworld, learning their heritage, their power, and their responsibilities as heirs. And they would spend time with Ethan, learning the things he taught: kindness without agenda, strength without cruelty, the quiet and unglamorous courage of simply showing up every day for the people you love. A formal alliance was established between the Drakari Dominion and the Human Concord. The first such treaty in galactic history, born not from military negotiation or economic pressure, but from the fact that one human had been kind to 2 children. The galaxy reacted the way the galaxy always reacted to things it did not understand, with confusion and debate and endless analysis. Xenosociologists wrote papers, diplomats gave speeches, news networks ran the story for weeks. An elder species ambassador, a being who had watched civilizations rise and fall for millennia, was asked to comment on how a single human had accomplished what no army or government ever could. He thought about it for a long time, and then he said something that would be carved into the stone above the entrance to the new human Drakari embassy. Humans do not conquer with fire. They conquer with the mad, irrational insistence on caring for things that are not theirs to care for. And somehow the galaxy is better for it. Zarvek fell. His fortress was taken. His forces were scattered. His name was erased from Drakari records in the old way, burned from every archive so thoroughly that within a generation no one would remember he had existed. The Queen's justice was absolute and swift and terrible, and it reminded the galaxy why her title was the Cataclysm. But that is not where the story ends. 6 months later, Ethan sat on the observation deck of his new ship. It was a medium freighter, because he had refused anything bigger. Vilethra had compromised by making it the most heavily armed medium freighter in the galaxy, shielded with Drakari warplate and carrying enough defensive systems to hold off a small fleet. Ethan had sighed and accepted it, because he was learning that arguing with the Dragon Queen was like arguing with weather. Kira and Sail were beside him, cross-legged on the floor. Their scales gleamed void black and gold in the starlight, beautiful and fierce and healthy. They were arguing over a board game with the intensity that only children could bring to something so trivial and so important at the same time. The hologram projector hummed, and Vilethra appeared, regal and vast, even as a projection. She looked at the girls. She looked at the board game. She looked at the remains of dinner on the table. "Did they eat their vegetables?" she asked. "Kira hid hers under the plate," Ethan said. "I did not," Kira said immediately and unconvincingly. Vilethra's eyes narrowed in a way that transcended species. "Kira." "Fine. I ate most of them." Ethan and Vilethra exchanged a look. It was brief, and it carried no warmth in the traditional sense. But it held something else. A mutual respect so deep it did not need words. The understanding between two people who would burn the universe for the same children, and who had found in each other, not a friend exactly, something rarer, a fellow guardian. The hologram faded. Kira won the board game and let out a roar of triumph that rattled the viewport glass. Sail responded by flipping the board and sending pieces flying across the deck. Ethan sighed. He picked up the pieces one by one. "Bed," he said. "Both of you. Now. 5 more minutes. Now." Grumbling and protesting and dragging their feet in the universal language of children who did not want bedtime to exist, they shuffled down the corridor. Ethan followed, tucked them in, checked the heat lamps, and turned on the little star-shaped nightlight he had bought on Helo's station a lifetime ago. "Ethan," Sail said quietly from her cot. "Yes, sweetheart. Thank you for finding us." He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, warm scale against weathered skin. "Thank you for letting me." He dimmed the lights and walked back to the observation deck. Outside the viewport, moving in slow and silent orbit around the ship, was a Drakari war dragon, the size of a small moon. Its 6 wings folded, its ancient eyes half-closed in patient watch. It was the Queen's personal guardian, assigned to protect her children's human father for as long as he lived. Ethan glanced at it, nodded once the way you might nod at a neighbor, and sat down with his coffee. The stars stretched out before him, vast and cold and full of dangers he could not imagine, and wonders he had never dreamed of. Somewhere out there, empires schemed and fleets clashed, and ancient powers played their endless games of dominance. Ethan did not care about any of it. He had dishes to wash and lunches to pack, and a star map to teach in the morning, and 2 girls who needed him to be there when they woke up. He took a sip of his coffee. It was a good night to be a dad.